Bienvenue à Montréal Baroque virtuel 2020. We're very excited to welcome David Shammer, director of the Jerusalem Baroque Orchestra and fantastic harpsichordist. David, I think the first time I met you was in 1983 at Mishkanot Sha'ananim, where you were in charge of an early music course where I was teaching with Bruce and my tiny baby kids. And a few things I remember about that. One was the supersonic planes going over every so often that scared us all, but I think you were used to it. And I also remember how passionate you were about music. And I'm wondering what music led you into this funny little area, early music.
Well, I can actually be quite specific about it. It was a very specific piece. It was the second movement of the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto, which I heard on the radio when I was already a student in London. I just started early music program. Excuse me?
You were a student in harpsichord already?
Yes.
Yes.
I was student in harpsichord, but I wasn't quite sure which direction to take at that time. And one morning I just woke up and switched on BBC Radio 3, and there was this divine music played in a way. Of course, I knew the music and I immediately recognized it, but I never heard it just like that. And it was played on original instruments with members of the English concert. It was Trevor Pinnock, who eventually I became a student of.
Interesting.
And that was the moment when I decided, okay, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my days.
It's interesting. We can both thank the BBC, because when I was 8, I heard Monteverdi, the beginning of Orfeo, and that's what inspired me to do early music.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's when and then after your studies, you went back to Israel.
Right.
And then what happened?
And then, well, pretty much after that, that's what was the event that you described. You came then with Lorette Goldberg,
Exactly.
bless her memory. I remember that was the first time that I actually met Lorette. I mean, I met her before when she came a few years earlier, but we never met in person. I just heard her presentation and a concert. And on this occasion, in '83, we did meet, and she said, "Dear, we don't have much time. We have to become friends immediately."
I should just explain that Lorette Goldberg was a harpsichordist from San Francisco and a fantastic entrepreneur in early music. She did many things.
Exactly. And she was the one who brought you guys over to Jerusalem.
Exactly.
And asked me to help with the organization of this event. So, and then she decided that there must be a Baroque orchestra in Jerusalem. There's no way there won't be one. And so she kept coming and also bringing you and Michael Sand for several times. And then Michael came on himself, on his own. But it didn't work out quite as well as expected because for a variety of technical reasons, I don't want to go into it. And more or less by the year of 1980, I would say 6 or 7, it seemed to be that this project is not going to continue. Anyway, the Jerusalem Music Center, Mishkanot Sha'ananim, didn't want to sponsor it anymore. And then I thought,
I remember the 80s well. I mean, it was the end of the first hot period in our lifetimes of early music all over the world, and it was, as we say, a granola happening, and a lot of young. We were all young and eager to do something other than regular classical music performance, and especially in Israel, where there's so many fantastic sort of lot of Russian trained modern musicians and the greatest orchestra. But you were appealing to another kind of crowd, I think.
Would you describe yourself as a pioneer in Israel then, David?
Excuse me?
Would you describe yourself as a pioneer of early music in Israel? We here in Canada, we know very little about what is going on in Israel. So it would be interesting to see, to hear what your role is and how the early music movement took off in Israel.
Well, when I came back from London, that was the end of 1982, just a few months before Laurette and Susie and Bruce and Michael came. There were, I think maybe you could count on fingers of both your hands, people who played early instruments at any level, and mostly not at a very high level. So it was a beginning from scratch.
Were you the only harpsichordist at that point?
Sorry?
Were you about the only harpsichordist at that point?
Well, it's hard to tell. You need to define the harpsichordist for that.
Okay. Let's not go there.
But let's say there weren't very, very many, or there were very, very few, if there were any more. And some people tried to play Baroque strings, and some people tried to play Baroque winds. Many of them not very well. Some were actually quite promising and talented, and are still doing it. But anyway, it was a very, very small scene, if you can call it a scene at all, at that stage. So it was starting from zero.
And then what happened in the 90s?
Well, in the 90s, first of all, by the end of the 80s, I decided to start an orchestra. And there was absolutely no reason to do that, because for an orchestra, you need players and you need instruments, and we had neither. So we started with people who were interested, had no idea about it, and had to adjust their modern violins and cellos to some kind of quasi-Baroque settings. And, you know, little by little, in the 1990s, it was already an orchestra. And more people came, and more instruments. We just got instruments from here and from there, and some were transported, and some were bought, and people started going abroad to study. And then they by the end of the 90s, they started coming back with a lot more experience and with a lot more knowledge. So gradually, it became what it is now, 30 years later, an orchestra that I am very much proud of it.
And was there an excited and passionate audience from the beginning?
Well, yes, not very large, but very passionate, very excited, indeed. I remember the first concert. We just a year ago, we celebrated 30 years of that first concert. It happened on June 29th. 1989, and it was totally packed, and we played like terrible. But it was packed, and people were very enthusiastic, and apparently we just got credit for trying and for making it happen against all odds.
And when you compare those days to today, how different does it feel, or how different is it to be around these days with an orchestra in our present situation? You mean a present situation as a COVID situation? No, present situation as where we are in terms of like history and early music movement. Let's forget about the COVID for a split second.
Yes, well, of course, it's completely different now. I think it's completely different also elsewhere. Early music is not a niche anymore.
Right.
It is very much part of the mainstream. And when you look at programs of, I don't know, of Covent Garden or Glenbourne Opera Festival, and you hear there are productions of Baroque operas with original instruments and stuff like that. That means that it became for quite some time already, it became part of the musical life. It's not something that just crazy people do.
Crazy people like us.
Like us,
And
exactly.
have, for instance, members of the Israel Philharmonic themselves started to play early instruments?
Well, yes, there are some. I wouldn't say there are many, but certainly there are some, both on string instruments and wind instruments. One of our natural trumpet players is, for instance, is a player of a philharmonic. One of our violinists is a violinist in the philharmonic. It became less and less unusual for very good modern instrument players to become interested and become very proficient.
Tell me, do you feel that the style of playing and the approach to early music has been influenced by that, by the fact that modern players are now very much involved?
Yes, I think so. I think this is the influence is mutual. Several years ago, already actually almost 20 years ago, I was writing a paper for my DMA degree in the States, and in this paper I wrote something like the modern orchestras are playing Baroque in such and such way, and my instructor said, "When did you last hear a modern orchestra play Baroque music?" I said, "Well, that's a very well-known fact that they are playing it in a very modern way." He said, "No, not anymore, and you should be aware of it."
Yes, we have. I learned a lot from
the change of style of playing Baroque music, playing Baroque repertoire with modern orchestras is quite amazing in the last few decades. And of course, the influence goes the other direction as well. Maybe we have somewhat less purity now in the historical performance field than there was in the 80s.
Well, what I was wondering, what influence that had on your own programming for the Jerusalem Baroque Orchestra. You have exquisite ideas. Would be interesting for us to hear. What is your approach to programming? What kind of ideas you have been realizing in the past?
I like to make it easy on myself. I like to play music that I like. Of course, not always things that I like are necessarily very popular. And not everything that is very popular is necessarily something that I like. So I'm trying to reach some balance between repertoire, which is
so you go
likely
back and forth
to attract audiences. Yes, and the repertoire which I hope someday will become a part of the canon. And it does actually happen. 15 years ago, one wouldn't dare to have a program of Monteverdi in Israel. Nowadays, it's not a big deal.
I see. Well, thanks to your work to a big degree.
And what about French music?
French music is still an issue. Again, speaking of things that I like most, French music features very prominently there. But making a program of all French music would be daring. So we do French music more and more, I must say. But we also, in the same program, try to have some things that are not totally disconnected, like some Bach pieces which are written in French style, Handel, and so on and so forth.
So actually the program that we had cooked up together, the collaboration between Jerusalem Baroque Orchestra, Montreal Baroque Festival, and Ensemble Caprice, because we had some French music, the Te Deum, the famous Te Deum by Marc-Antoine Charpentier, but also some Telemann and other music. So this would be like a typical melting pot that should work well in either country, in Israel and in Canada.
That's right. Yes. And that's why it's particularly a pity that we couldn't do it these days. But we'll do it
Indeed.
next year.
Absolutely.
And I had a
Yeah.
question about your chamber music, because you also have a smaller groups apart from the Jerusalem Baroque Orchestra, I believe.
Well, I used to. There was a group called the Jerusalem Consort. This group recorded several CDs and played concerts here and there in Israel and abroad. But not for a while now, for a variety of reasons. There are groups ad hoc, more or less, and there are still chamber concerts, of course, and we do play chamber repertoire. Some of it is the best.
Of course. So no, I was
Yeah.
just wondering if, as here in many parts of the world, the notion of improvisation and more freedom of expression is infiltrating in Israel also.
Yes, it does.
And I mention this partly because the 2020 festival has a lot of improvisation as part of the programming.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say that we have programs that center on improvisation, but of course, it very much depends on specific players. There are players who are more prone to improvise, and there are players who are less. So those who are do actually incorporate improvisational elements in their performances of Baroque music. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, within improvisation, I'm thinking also of ornamentation and much more freedom of expression.
Indeed. Yes.
And I think we have just time for one more question. We have all been struck by the worldwide pandemic, both musicians and audience and everybody. I was wondering, David, from your end, as a musician, what comes to your mind? What does that mean, being a musician in times of COVID-19?
Well, personally, I would say it means more practice.
Oh,
That's impressive.
Because all of a sudden there is time for it, and as you probably know, there is never enough time for practice.
Now we are better than ever, but we can't actually show our art.
Yes, well, we did, as a matter of fact. In the middle of this crisis, we recorded some live streams and broadcasted it. So we were not completely devoid of performance, so-called in audience. I mean,
Well,
the
that's
virtual
clear.
audience, but still.
And when you say we, how many of you?
I
mean,
well, sometimes it was just 2 or 3, but we also recorded a program with 9 participants, except all 9 were never together, only for a very brief moment were together on the same.
So you were recording separately?
Excuse me?
You were each recording in your own little bubble separately?
Oh, no. That we did too, but this is more like a gimmick, because you cannot really make a good quality recording when you do it in a grid. But we recorded in the same hall with proper recording, video and audio recording equipment, but there was no audience.
So, David, we feel we are socially distanced from you, but we feel very well connected. And here in Montreal, we are all looking forward to have you here next year, David Schemmer and the Jerusalem Baroque Orchestra, with their first appearance in Montreal. So we all hope and wish that time will fly, so we will see you as soon as possible here in Montreal. Thank you so much for this wonderful interview. It was great to see and hear what's going on in Israel. And well, Montreal will roll out the red carpet next year when you show up for the festival. Thank you very much.
We can't wait.
Thank you. And neither can we.
Okay, bye-bye, David.
Bye-bye.